Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aquinas Center and the latest of our series called What's Next? Just for those of you who haven't been here before, the Aquinas Center has been affiliated with Emory University since 1987. We've been able to bring in some wonderful theologians from around the country. About a year and a half ago, we were approached by a couple parishes that wanted to link up with each other to somehow address the abuse crisis in the church and the leadership crisis that fostered that. And so that we started meeting monthly. If anybody is interested in being a part of that group, we meet usually the second Saturday of every month here in this building from 8:30 till 10. I know it's early, but for many people, it then allows people to do the rest of their day and whatever plans they've made. So we meet second Saturday of every month from 8:30 to 10. If you're interested, I know there will be some cards if you don't have them in front of you now. You can sign up and give us your email address and we'll make sure you have the information for the next meeting. In addition, on that card, we'd like you to put down any ideas you might have. The What's Next series grew out of this interparish partnership that we have, saying that we, as lay people, need to be educated if we want to take our rightful place as baptized believers in the governance of the church. That's why we started doing this. And so we've had 4 things so far. We had Father Jerry McGlone last February talking about the sex abuse crisis, fact, fiction, and future. We had a panel in April, again, looking at the issue. In September, we had Dr. Rick Gallardi speak about turning the pyramid over, and he talked about ecclesiology and the role of lay people in the church. In October, we had Carrie Robinson from the Leadership Roundtable speak about church management and lay people engaged in the management of the church. And today, we're speaking about Canon Law and how it impacts lay involvement in the church or not. And so I wanted to offer you the opportunity to give us ideas for other topics that you think we need to address as we look at what's next in the future of the church. So before the evening's over, we'll pass out those cards. You'll see on the one side, it's an assessment card. We don't want to use it as an assessment card. We want to use it as an idea card so that you can let us know if there are topics that you think we need to bring folks in that can address. So that's it. My next task is to introduce our speaker. So Tom Doyle came to me just before this. He says, "Who's doing the introduction? Just give them my name." So I met Tom this afternoon at the airport for the first time. I've read articles about him, and he's done a lot of work with, particularly with victims of abuse, and he's been called many times as an expert witness on with church court and with civil court. So since 1984, he's been doing this. So he's a canon lawyer. So we have with us someone who's had a lot of experience on the topic and a lot of experience with the education to work on what canon law says about how we can be more engaged or not with the church. So without further ado, I introduce Tom Doyle.
When I was contacted about giving the talk and asked to speak about how canon law can help enable and empower lay people to creating I guess a better church would be one way to look at it. The first thought that came to my mind is, well, I can take care of this talk in one sentence. It's useless. I've been a canon lawyer since 1978 in a lot of different venues, had a lot of different duties. Since 1984, I have been deeply involved in the issue of sexual violation of children by Catholic clerics. I didn't plan on it. I didn't envision that as being the direction my life would go in. I was working at the time deeply inside in the Vatican Diplomatic Service in Washington, D.C. For better or for worse, when we were first notified of this issue, the first case, I began to get involved, and I'm not going to give you my whole story, but two things affected me profoundly. One was when I met the first victims, a 10-year-old boy from Louisiana. And when I looked at this little boy's face, it was blank. I'll never forget his face as long as I live. He had been one of the victims of Gilbert Gote. He had been violently, sexually abused. He'd been anally raped numerous times at the age of 8 and 9 and 10. And so seeing that left a lasting impression on my life. And that changed this issue for me from something written down on pieces of paper with just names and numbers and descriptions to a human issue, a real human issue. And I could not figure out, I couldn't process that this was happening. And I began to find out that it was happening and had been happening since the beginning of the church. And I also began to find out before too long that there was, first I thought that when the bishops found out about this issue, thinking they didn't know about it, when they found out about how bad this is, they're all going to snap to right away and do the right thing. And I was dead wrong, deader than dead wrong. And what I discovered before too long was that rather than do that, they were doing everything they could possibly do to keep it covered up, to organize some sort of defense, because now the deep, dark, filthy secrets were coming out. And every effort was being made at that time to keep the lid on. And this was so horrific an issue that the lid did not stay on. So my perspective, my context, I guess, my frame of reference about all of what I'm going to say tonight is having been in the midst of this nightmare for 35 years on all angles. I've worked with victims, I've worked with their parents, I've tried to help accused priests who also have a right to due process. I've been involved in European cases, European countries, with their investigatory commissions. I worked for the Australian Commission. So I'm not telling you this to impress you, but I'm trying to show you that I do know a little bit about what I'm speaking about. So some of the things I say are going to sound pretty crazy and pretty radical, and they are radical because the issue demands radical action. The Second Vatican Council was a turning point in what I think was a gradual paradigmatic shift for the Roman Catholic Church. But it was an event that brought the transforming forces from pure speculation into reality, because he had all the bishops in the world in Rome doing something they weren't quite sure what they were doing, and that was to start trying to change and bring the Catholic Church from the Middle Ages into at least the 20th century, or the beginning of the 20th century. It was changes that they had brought about in every dimension of the life of the Catholic Church. And the interesting thing about these changes was that these were implemented, voted upon by men who were made bishops, archbishops, and cardinals. They were products of the church triumphant under Pope Pius XII. We used to say in the seminary that Pope Pius XII was the fourth person of the Trinity because he knew the unknowable. This launched an era of hope, and it was a hope that we were moving from the medieval world to the 20th century, but unfortunately we were moving from the medieval world to the 20th century with no intermediate stop, and this was bound to produce problems, was bound to produce chaos, questions, and a very negative backlash, which was true. The institutional transformation to the bright new world a lot of people thought was going to be on the other side, many predicted, did not quite go according to schedule. In fact, not many years after the council closed in 1965, the forward motion kind of ground down to low gear at a glacial speed. And the crucial, I think, theological truth that guided the movement for needed changes and in structures and in actions and in attitudes and in liturgy was the emergence of a renewed theological understanding of baptism. This is the first of the sacraments, and for most of our lifetimes, it has been buried or cloaked in the magical thinking that defined it as an insurance policy against a kind of a boring eternity in limbo. That's an area that came under critical reevaluation after the council until it was finally closed down, and only officially in 2007. But nevertheless, the superstitious fear of the fate of unbaptized babies, unbaptized children, unbaptized anybody, unfortunately lives on in the imaginations of many. The traditional teaching on the notion of original sin and its effects has buried the real meaning of baptism under a thick blanket of fear and fantasy. Question remains, are we at the point where the cultural understanding of baptism has caught up with the theological image of the sacrament as a sacrament of welcoming into the body of believers, as a sacrament really of commissioning the believers into being leaders and movers and shakers in the life of the body of Christ? Or is it still the sacrament that makes sure you don't go to limbo, which is this area that the old church, the magical kingdom had? Canon Law talks about the body of believers, and it says that refers to an equality with regard to the dignity and the activity whereby all cooperate in the building up of the body of Christ. Here's the kicker: according to each one's condition and function. These last 8 words are the wet blanket. And they are a wet blanket because if you put them in context with Canon 207 that just precedes it, there you have the creation of the God-intended clerical state. Among the Christian faithful by divine origin, there exist in the church sacred ministers who are also called clerics in law, and other Christian faithful who are called laity. So most of you are the others. Then there's a few who are designed by God to be part of this upper level. So the forward movement that we were all hoping for, and I still remember it. I was in the student aid. I was ordained in 1970, but I was in seminary during the years, the first years after the council. And there's a lot of hope. Things started slowing down within a few years after the council closed, but it definitely went south after Pope John Paul II was elected in October of 1978. The declericalization that the council started in hopes of doing just that never really got past the cosmetic changes that were symbolized by the alterations to some of the costumes that the clerical aristocracy wore. And when that happened, there was a lot of pushback from that too, because apparently all these robes had some sort of metaphysical meaning. John Paul II was the driving force behind the obsession with doctrinal orthodoxy with an emphasis on human sexuality, absolute loyalty to the Pope, the elevation of the role of the bishop, and the exaltation of the priesthood with the emphasis on the ontological change mystique. Another irony is that while he was exalting the priests, and especially the bishops, he was also centralizing more and more power back to the papal office. And the meager advances that laypersons had made, especially the liturgical roles, were now being rolled back. Revision of the Code of Canon Law actually started in 1959, but it never really went into high gear until the council ended, because they had to use a lot of the documents, a lot of the changes, a lot of the different pronouncements of the council to incorporate the changes that they were mandating for the church's legal system. But the final product went into effect on November 23rd, 1983. And although the ultimate version of the revision was controlled by a very small group of Vatican insiders, there still was hope that the advances looking to more inclusiveness, minimal though they were, would be grounded in a reactivation of of the meaning of church not as a hierarchical kingdom, but as the people of God. And the concept of church as people of God is enshrined in the Constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, paragraph 32. But what was also going on when that was being formulated was there was a very, very strong minority pushback that wanted to make sure that that was combined with a description of the church as the institution, saying that the institution, the monarchy, is the same as the people of God. Now, you know and I know that that is not true. Because the institution that we're talking about, the monarchical governmental structure, is something that was created at a time when that was the only governmental structure anybody knew anything about. At a time, around the era of Constantine. And the myth that Jesus Christ came down to St. Peter and gave him, here's a memo that tells you how to set up the church. This is it right here. Monarchy, bishops, and so on and so forth. And there's no evidence for that in Scripture, in tradition, anywhere. But it's justified because it's always been there. Keep saying it and it becomes so. So the last thing, however, that John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the Vatican bureaucracy and the majority of bishops ever expected was the fallout from the clergy sexual abuse phenomenon that surfaced in 1984. They never expected this, thinking that this is a flash in the pan, it's not going to last long, we'll get it all under control, and then move forward like it was before. The transforming process of the church is underway once again. But this time, it's not propelled by edicts from on high or from bishops from on high. It's propelled by a widespread, diverse reaction to the irreconcilable dissonance between the preaching and the promises of the ecclesiastical leadership and the harsh reality of their contradictory response to and continued enabling of the sexual violation of the most vulnerable members of the body of Christ by the clergy. Those two concepts are irreconcilable. The hypocrisy between the two cannot in any manner, way, shape, or form be found to be justified even in the most minuscule way. So the entrenched practice of destructive sexual behavior has itself been a component, a major component, of the transforming force because of what it has revealed about the components, the essential components of the institutional church. What we have learned about the church, the system, and what has happened to lay people over the past 30 years is profound. There has not been a phenomenon like this in the history of the Catholic Church. The Council of Trent, reacting to the Protestant Reformation, was dealing with small potatoes compared to this. We're talking about the widespread, systemic sexual violation of children and minors and vulnerable adults. We're not talking about doctrinal issues, structural issues, things of that nature. This is far more serious, and it's going to have a far more profound effect. And for the first time in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, an issue that has had so much of a profound effect, the solution to that issue, which normally is something that's run by the bishops, as was the case with the Reformation and the reaction to that, which was the Council of Trent. This time around, it's radically different because the victims, their supporters, and the lay people are driving the bus, and they're not going to give up the driver's seat. And that is so obvious from my perspective, from what I see almost on a daily basis, day after day. It may not feel that way to a lot of people in the pews, but when you look at it from a distance, from a different perspective, you can see the free fall that's going on out there, with the inability, the Vatican can cook up pronouncements left, right, and center. That does not change reality. What changes reality is when those pronouncements become real. And they only become real when people like you, who are fed up with the nonsense, are going to stand up and say, change this, do it. It says you're supposed to do it, so do it. The victims, their supporters, vast numbers of Catholics, lay, and clergy have not reacted to this with passivity, waiting for the popes and the bishops to do something, a wait that would never, never end had they not been propelled by the shock and horror of the betrayal they saw not as isolated incidents, but as a whole culture, a way of life. And what was the way of life wasn't so much violating children on a regular basis, but covering it up, lying about it, making excuses, rejecting, stiff-arming the victims, ignoring their parents, doing everything you can to keep these people quiet and keep the problem down. Even the most, well, let me just back up and say that the victims and those who are allied with them, whether they're directly allied or not, have taken control. They have assumed control, they've taken charge, and they are determining the solutions. The solutions to this issue, the long-term and the short-term, are not coming from the hierarchical government, they're coming from down below. Everything that every bishop's conference has done, including this one, every one of the changes they've made in the diocese, the background checks, the Virtus, Presidium, every bit of that has been forced. Not one thing has been done proactively. And it's been forced because of the victims, because of the lawsuits, because of the pressure from the lay people, and because of the negative publicity. 5 years ago, the involuntary laicization of a cardinal was beyond the imagination of the conservatives, the liberals, and everybody in between. Even the most corrupt of the medieval and Renaissance popes never fired a cardinal. They may have assassinated those who got in their way, but they never defrocked them. And that's true. For the first time in the church's history, the hierarchy has not been able to determine or even influence the solution to the problem they have created. And three things are certain, and these are important as we look at the future of the meaningful life of the church. First, the laity did not cause this problem. I want the people of my diocese to pray and do penance for this problem. Wait a minute, time out, Bishop. You guys do that. We didn't cause this problem. The hierarchy caused it. And the clerical culture tried to cover it up. But the people of God will resolve it. That's for sure. Because otherwise there will be no resolution. And the forward movement is coming from the people of God. To say that the church has done nothing is not true. The church has. The real church, the people of God. They've extended the arm of friendship, of support, of sensitivity, of love to the victims and their families. I've seen that all over. Lay people, small groups of people, religious women, some priests even, who are brave enough to stand up to the bishops. And now it's even easier because the bishops know that if they fire a priest who's on the side of the victims, they're going to come out looking bad. So it's only because of the force of bad publicity. Nobody has said the right thing to do is to do this. So the bishop's individual and collective efforts, including those of the former Bishop of Rome, John Paul II, to deny, to minimize, to shift the blame, and to redefine the cause, have failed. The fumbling, usually self-serving attempts to figure out just how to manage the ever-growing epidemic have consistently been too little, too late, and in many cases, too irrelevant. Contemporary ecclesiastical system has long lost its ability to create and sustain church as envisioned by Lumen Gentium. The major obstacles. First is the obsession with preserving the image and influence of the hierarchy, deemed absolutely essential and necessary to have church. I went out for a walk one night when I was still working at the Vatican Embassy with the late Cardinal Bevilacqua, who was a bishop at the time, and a couple other guys on the staff. We were walking around, a beautiful summer night, and we got to talking. And I remember Tony Bevilacqua said, the only thing you need for church is a bishop. And I'm reflecting on, at that time I agreed with him because I was part of the system. Now looking at it, I said, that's the last thing you need. Number two, the systemic mendacity as an acceptable defense. And systemic mendacity is a nice way of saying institutional lying. Secrecy at all levels, and the fear of losing power. These are obstacles to the body of Christ. Key moments, some key moments in the transformation process. These are moments that have happened in our lifetime. These are just, subjective on my part, from my own experience. One key moment certainly was the very beginning, when that one family in 1990 and 1984 pulled out of a confidentiality agreement with the Bishop of Lafayette, Louisiana, got an attorney, went to court, and for the first time sued the Catholic Church for sexual abuse. That was number one. 1997 was the trial in Dallas for the victims of the now imprisoned Rudy Koss. Why was that important? That was important because it went on for about 6 or 8 weeks, and at the end, the jury awarded $119.7 million. That was a shot that went around the world. Nobody expected that. That was important because they recognized how serious this was. And it was important for some other reasons. One, and I was an expert witness at that, and I stood up in court and testified. The bishop was on the stand being asked a lot of questions by the plaintiff's attorneys. And he said, I don't have to answer these questions. Why not? Because I'm the bishop. So the judge says, did you bring your toothbrush? No, what do I need a toothbrush for? Because you're going to jail for contempt of court right as soon as this is done, unless you start talking. Well, he sang like a canary. But that's what it took. 2002 were the revelations launched by the Boston Globe. That was a major, major tsunami. And that, I thought naively, that was going to blow over after 2 or 3 weeks and we go back to business as usual, being on the minority, struggling to become believed and have credibility and struggling to make some progress. I was dead wrong, thank God. 2018, the Pennsylvania grand jury report, profound, where the state of Pennsylvania, recognizing that there was organized criminal behavior going on in the Catholic Church, had the courage to go ahead and launch a grand jury investigation into the 6 remaining dioceses that had not already been investigated. And I was involved in that as an expert and a consultant. And I got to tell you that some of the stuff that they saw would curl your hair. And it did curl the hair of these lawyers. They couldn't believe what they were reading or hearing or seeing. 2019, and another major, major move was when Cardinal McCarrick was not only removed from the College of Cardinals, but laicized by the Pope involuntarily. And as I said earlier, this had never happened. And Cardinal McCarrick was the golden boy. A lot of questions remain. How did he get to Washington? Because they knew about his activities in the Holy See before he was promoted to Washington from Newark. 2019 also, statute of limitation changes in New York, New Jersey, California, among others, after years of opposition from the bishops, costing over $15 million in hiring lobbyists and other shenanigans, and that's money from the people's pockets. All of the revelations, all the changes, in fact, all of the progress towards accountability and justice have been driven with the help of a small number of clerics, a small number of religious men and women, and a lot of lay people, and a lot of very, very brave survivors. Everything the institutional church has done, including the Dallas Charter and the essential norms, and the basic meeting in Dallas in 2002 was essentially engineered and put together by a public relations firm called M.M. Binder from New York City. A little true fact for you. Why does the church need public relations firms to work in dioceses to make the bishops look like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? There's something wrong with that picture. So everything that's happened, charter, the essential norms, which are the law of the church for the United States, have been forced by the combined efforts of victims, their attorneys, their supporters, their friends, the media, and the general lay population. When the bishops boast about all they've done, the reality is they've done nothing proactively. They've been forced to do all of this, everything. And some of them, I've got to admit, have done the right thing. They've tried to do the right thing. They've broken away from the mainstream. They've gone out to visit with victims. They've done, like in this archdiocese, I understand that the rule is you get somebody in here that says they've been sexually abused, go right to the DA without passing go or collecting $200. Now, in some dioceses, that's not the rule. Is you call the chancery first and don't call anybody else. The essential Catholic spirituality that we've grown up with is grounded in the seven sacraments. The return to the Eucharist is considered to be the ultimate source of healing, but this is simply irrelevant and insulting to most victims. They have been deeply violated both physically and spiritually by the men who are the custodians of the sacraments, and many times even within the context of receiving a sacrament. When Pope Benedict offered the return to the institution as the source of healing to the Irish people in his 2010 letter, it was seen by many, at least, as a misguided insult. And he said, quote, "But it is in the church that you will find Jesus Christ, who is the same today, yesterday, and forever. Seek a personal relationship with him within the communion of the church, for he will never betray your trust." Now that, to the people of Ireland, just didn't sit well, to say the very, very least, because this country had been so controlled beyond even our imagination by the bishops and the clergy. And the violations over there, the sexual violations, make what has happened in this country pale in many ways by comparison. So for too long, however, the system's responses have been in keeping with its patriarchal, monarchical nature. Come back to the church, the institution for healing, the place where you harmed and vilified and violated. Come back, we'll fix you. So no matter how well-intentioned some might have been, this simply doesn't work. It has tried to shift the responsibility, the hierarchy, to the laity with exhortations to fast, pray, do penance. They've tried liturgical penance services, which generally are not only shunned by victims, but considered meaningless at best, with a very few exceptions. The Holy See has tried apostolic visitations in Ireland, for example. That was a complete failure. It accomplished absolutely nothing except to accelerate the erosion of trust in that country. Now I want to say a couple things about what this phenomenon has revealed to us, to the church, to all of us. The sexual violation by clerics was originally described by defensive hierarchy as a few bad apples. But in fact, it's not been the few bad apples, but the problem has been the barrel. That's what the problem has been. The experience of the past 35 years has revealed a series of very harsh realities that have afflicted the people of God for centuries. Number one, the sexual violation of the vulnerable and other forms of corruption are deeply embedded in the clerical culture, with sexual issues being the most prominent and the most harmful. And I say that because I've been engaged for a number of years in some fairly deep research, and the earliest document talking about sexual violation of young men by males, by adult men, dates from 98, the Didache, Teaching of the 12 Apostles. 98. Now, there were no clergy then. There were no priests, there were no, I guess they were, the equivalent of what we'd call bishops. But the communities were led by whoever the elders were. And this was a rule. Why was it made a rule? Because it was necessary. The first actual law of the church dates to 309, the Council of Elvira in southern Spain, which legislated for the first time canon laws about sexual violation. And then you look to the penitential books, which were used in the British Isles and elsewhere up until about the 11th century, and you find example after example after example of penances that were written into these books to help priests during confessions to administer to people who were confessing all sorts of sexual sins. And among them, with some regularity, was violation of children and nuns and women and animals. And for all of these, you got stiff penances, and some of them, especially violation of children by a cleric. The higher you were in the ranks, the bigger the penance. So if you were like a bishop, you weren't even given communion at the time of your death if you had violated a child. So the hierarchical system, that's the institutional church, has been incapable and unwilling to probe deeply into the systemic causes. The bishops advertised the 2010 John Jay study, Causes and Context, as the answer. But it clearly missed the point by a wide, wide margin, and it served only as a temporary distraction because they were not allowed to get into the systemic causes. They denied that, but I was involved with them, and I got that straight out of their mouth. They were in regular contact with the conference, and they were not allowed to look at what we call systemic causes. In other words, what is it about the hierarchical bishop system that's causing this to happen? Instead, they blame it on the 60s. Free love, everything that was going on. And my analogy there was the whole reason there's a lot of sexual abuse, it was Janis Joplin's fault. And I'm one of her biggest fans. So when I said that at the Australian hearing, I was brought over there to testify before the commission. I found out that Gail Furness, who was the leading prosecutor doing most of the questioning, she and I were contemporaries, about the same age. And we got together afterwards, and she was as much a fan of Janis as I was. But the question came up, well, what about all the sexual abuse that happened in the 40s and 50s? Benny Goodman. That's it. All these extraneous cultural factors did not cause men to sexually violate children. And it did not cause bishops to cover it up. That's where the problem is. Finally, the church that has been revealed is far different than the one most of us know and have been accustomed to and have grown up with. The toxic swamp of sexual abuse and hierarchical cover-up and bumbling are part of the church. They're not a tangential accident. They're not something that's sitting outside, but it's a dark side of this institution, a very dark side. And it's been there as long as the institution has been in existence. And the challenge of the past 35 years has not been to find new and effective ways to bury the problem and return the church to life as it was. That's not going to happen. The real challenge is to identify the fundamental questions and continue on the painful journey of understanding them. First, why has the institutional church attracted a significant number of men who are emotionally and sexually immature and often psychosexually disturbed, and why has the clerical culture continued to enable this condition? By creating systems of education that only prevent any type of maturation. Why is the hierarchical governmental system and its clerical culture not only allowed, but enabled the worldwide plague of sexual abuse? Why have the ordained pastors been incapable of comprehending the profound depth of spiritual damage done to the victims, to their loved ones, and to the entire Christian community, and equally incapable of finding effective paths to healing? I have not seen one statement coming out of the Holy See that's talked primarily about the spiritual damage done to the victims and how we can work to try to discover that and to heal it, not once. The answer is not go back to communion. The answer is not go to confession. Some bishops have actually said that when they've talked to victims. Now, you should go and make a good confession. One woman I know said, me? No, you're the one that's got to go to confession. And she got up and walked out of his office. And that's the truth. Why has there been such obsessive concern for the image of the hierarchy and the security of the clerical caste? And why has there been an inability to recognize that those who have been violated are also the church? Finally, what is the basis for the fear of examining and evaluating the traditional teaching on human sexuality and the key issues that follow upon it: mandatory celibacy, ordination of married men, and ordination of married and single women? What is so fearful about that? Now, apparently the Pope, the ex-Pope, and Cardinal Sarah have just authored a book claiming celibacy. We need it. So now there's a big stink about it because Benedict says he really didn't get involved in it. So who knows? But I'm going to read it just to see what they have to say. But I'm sure it'll be nothing more than a collection of the same tripe that we've heard for centuries about how wonderful celibacy is and how we need it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it doesn't work. That's a fact. Unless you really want it and are born with it and are given the charism to lead it. Plenty are. Plenty aren't. The initial consideration of these questions leads to the acknowledgement of some primary areas of causality. And this acknowledgement is merely the beginning of what has to be a thorough and a fearless probing into the deepest levels of their essence and the role they have played in the life of the institution. And these are the systemic issues that go right to the very, very bottom. First, the concept of priesthood, which is essential to the Roman Catholic Church, so we're told. The distorted and the potentially destructive definition or meaning that is protected by canon law and the clerical subculture today and in the past. This is a barrier. It's the focus on the sacrificial dimension as primary and the minimization and even dismissal of the pastoral dimension of the priesthood. Why is it that bishops welcome priests from other countries who can hardly speak English into their dioceses to answer the needs of personnel placement issues? Simply because they can do the sacraments. They can say Mass, they can give absolution. You don't have to speak English, you don't have to be compassionate, you don't have to know anything about American culture. That's all that's necessary. But that's not what priesthood is. I can tell you that from my experience. The most vital and important stuff I ever did as a priest were not in church. And they were not connected with the administration of sacraments. They were simply being with... I never really knew what pastoral care of the sick was until I was an Air Force chaplain and was taken on visits to hospitals with one of the other chaplains, one of the Protestant guys. I thought at that time, the more people you could anoint, the more successful your visitation was. So they'd be sitting there, out cold, you go in and do your thing and move on. So I'd start going to these with these Protestant guys, and we'd be visiting our people at a hospital, and they'd sit down, they'd hold their hand, they'd sing a hymn to them, they'd talk to them, they'd chit-chat and sit there for the longest time. That's what it is. And I learned that just by being with these men and finding out that transference of energy, of care, not mechanistic, but it really is showing that somebody's there to be supportive and loving to them. So then we come to what we talked about a little bit before, the model of the heroic priesthood championed by John Paul II, and in his view, exemplified by Marcial Maciel, the founder of the Legion of Christ, who was protected by John Paul II, by Angelo Sedano, and by Jizwiz, his secretary, and a few others because they were taking massive payoffs. In the words of the recent editorial in the NCR on this heroic priesthood, it says, it's built on sand and grand delusions about ontological differences and hierarchical nonsense. An apt description. Monarchical governmental structure. Do we need this? This model, long presumed to be immovable because of its divine origin, has created a false concept of church, one that must be protected at all costs because it is the source of clerical power. Being part of the hierarchical model, the hierarchical governmental structure, gives men their identity, gives them a past, a present, and a future. And we're taught to believe that the hierarchical structure is essential for our salvation because that's where we get the sacraments. And it's essential that we protect it at all costs and protect the bishops who are the pillars of this hierarchical structure. Now, the problem there is that this structure has demanded that these offices be protected at all costs, even to the sacrifice of children. And I don't think that that is what the Lord intended by any stretch of the imagination. This hierarchical model is a stratified society. It's diametrically opposed to the concept of the people of God. The clerical aristocracy prevents a living model of church that is grounded in true baptismal equality. A lot of great priests, a lot of great bishops, but the whole system is the problem. And it's still sustained, and it's still living, and it's going to continue to be such as long as we let it happen. Pastoral care. The institutional model of pastoral care is grounded in the sacramental and liturgical rituals with magical beliefs about their unseen powers and effects, all of which are directly connected to the actions of the ordained ministers. The priests and the bishops control the sacraments. They're the ministers of the sacraments. They're the ones who tell you whether you can have the sacrament or not. Even in the case of marriage, where we're taught that the spouses are the ministers, the priest has to give the blessing for validity, for all practical purposes. So the sacraments, the lay people and anyone else receiving the sacrament is in a passive dependent relationship with the clergy, the clerical hierarchy, who controls it. Power. It's all about power. It's all about keeping the difference between us and them. And this depends on an official spirituality that's defined by obedience to the hierarchy and dependence on the sacramental model. Now we'll get into canon law now, your favorite topic. Canon law is the church's oldest legal system. It's the oldest continuously functioning legal system in the world. I have a very soft spot in my heart for canon law. I find it absolutely fascinating to study it. The history of it especially, I became very, very much imbued with medieval law when I was doing my studies, to the point that when I went and studied and did my research at the Institute of Medieval Law in California and wanted to go into it full time, but my sponsor, Cardinal Cody, had other ideas. He said, we need you in the tribunal, and a degree in medieval law really isn't going to help us. So I said, okay, you're paying the freight, I'll come home. But the fact is, canon law as a system for righting the wrongs of the church, for bringing due process, for bringing justice on an objective, across-the-board basis is completely useless. It becomes good when it's made good by the people who are both administering it and by the people who are the recipients, you all, by making sure these rules and regulations get followed. Historically, transparency, which is also known as institutional honesty. I don't know when transparency came in as one of the buzzwords, but I like to use honesty because it's more direct. Boom. You either are honest or you're not honest. This has not existed as a universal value applicable to all members. It is defeated by the requirement of secrecy that covers all judicial and most administrative proceedings in the church. Secrecy is essential to sustain the power upon which the clerical culture is based. The obsession with secrecy has supported the erroneous belief that the church is not only separate from, but superior to civil society. The culture of secrecy is more deeply entrenched than the canonical regulations which support it. Because canon law talks about secrecy, but that only supports the culture of secrecy. Even without the canonical rules, we would still have this obsession with secrecy. Why? I mean, that's the subject of somebody's doctoral dissertation, but it's a good subject. The protection of institutionalized secrecy has led to the weakening of the governmental system and to the erosion of trust and respect for the bishops. And the insistence on it is primarily for the protection of power, in spite of any other justifications offered, primarily in the area of canonical criminal prosecution. This obsession is not only counterproductive to honest governance, but it's also a barrier to accountability. And a classic example of secrecy backfiring involved the Irish bishops. In 1996, the Irish bishops published a set of guidelines for responding to the sexual abuse reports they were receiving. And these guidelines included mandatory reporting to civil officials. In 1997, the Holy See sent a response to the bishops by way of a letter that was circulated by the papal nuncio at the time, Luciano Storero. This secret letter was leaked in 2011, leaked in July of 2011. And this, essentially, the letter told the Irish bishops to drop their reporting requirement. Drop it. The letter went public at the same time the Klein Report was published on July 13th, 2011. And on July 20th, 2011, Enda Kenny, who was the Irish Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, gave a public address to the Irish Parliament. And this address had the effect of a nuclear device. I'm going to read a little bit of it. I had the privilege of listening to it in the flesh. I wasn't there. I was on a hookup at home because they wanted me to be on a panel to comment on it. I could not believe my ears. And I have to admit that when he was talking, tears were coming down my cheeks. I was so proud of my Irish heritage. This is what he said. It is fair to say that after the Ryan and Murphy reports, Ireland is perhaps unshockable when it comes to the abuse of children. But Klein has proved to be of a different order. Because for the first time in Ireland, a report into child sexual abuse exposes an attempt by the Holy See to frustrate an inquiry in a sovereign democratic republic as little as 3 years ago and not 3 decades ago. And in doing so, the Klein Report excavates the dysfunction, disconnection, elitism, the narcissism that dominate the culture of the Vatican to this day. The rape and torture of children were downplayed or managed to uphold instead the primacy of the institution, its power, its standing, and its reputation. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger said, standards of conduct appropriate to civil society or the workings of a democracy cannot be purely and simply applied to the church. As the Holy See prepares its considered response to the Klein Report, as Taoiseach, I am making it absolutely clear that when it comes to the protection of children in this state, the standards of conduct which the Church deems appropriate to itself cannot and will not be applied to the workings of democracy and civil society in this republic, not purely or simply or otherwise. 10 years or 5 years prior, this would never have happened. No head of state in modern history has ever addressed the Holy See with such candor and such accuracy. What is both historic and remarkable is that this address came not from the head of a nation officially hostile to the Catholic Church, officially pagan, or a purely secular nation, but from the leader of the country that is commonly believed to be the most Catholic nation on the planet. Soon after this address, Ireland recalled its ambassador to the Holy See and in November 2011 closed its embassy. In September 2011, the Vatican withdrew its own ambassador, Archbishop Giuseppe Leanza. This historic episode is part of a profound cultural change experienced in Ireland, and it was and is the direct result of the reversal of the balance of power between the Irish people and the hierarchy. Accountability in the code and in actual practice is heavily qualified by the distinction between lay and cleric, and further by the distinction between priest and bishop. Due process is compromised in Canon 221, but the dependence on due process is promised in Canon 221, but the dependence on the process for the vindication of rights is arbitrary, depending on the wishes of the bishop, or in the case of bishops, the wishes of the Pope. Pope Francis' recent decree, Vos Estis Lux Mundi, falls short when it comes to calling bishops to account. Instead of answering to a higher authority, the papacy, they're answerable to the local metropolitan archbishop, which is no guarantee of a consistent objective and consistent action. As long as the governmental system remains monarchical, there will be no effective mechanisms for objective accountability. Accountability that's applicable to all, to lay, cleric, religious, and prelate alike. For this change, there must be an end to the belief in the mythical and incomprehensible ontological difference between those in holy orders, priests and bishops, especially bishops, and those who are not. I asked Bishop Jeff Robinson, a former auxiliary bishop in Australia, who is an incredible man. One day I said, Jeff, this ontological difference, what does that mean? And his answer to me was, quote, it's nothing more than ecclesiastical gibberish. I've never met a person, priest or otherwise, philosopher, theologian, who could explain what ontological difference means. I'm supposed to have gone through it. I don't remember it. Now, governance, that's the participation in the decision-making for the community and the participation in its leadership. Prior to the 1983 code, all governmental positions, even minor consequence, were restricted to priests and bishops because of the requirement that participation in the power of governance required holy orders. The 1983 code repeats the same general distinction and restriction in Canon 129, but it qualifies the absolute prohibition by stating that, quote, lay members of the faithful can cooperate in the exercise of the same power according to the normal law. That means if you're part of some council, you get the right to go out and bring coffee in for the priests. To cooperate, what does that mean? Now, I, having been in the system, know what it means. It's a pious pap. It's an excuse, and it's a smokescreen for giving you something and not giving you something, making it look like you're sharing in governance, but you're really not. And when you do try to exercise your right, generally speaking, you don't get very far because you're up against an entire system that does not want to be broached. The concept of effective sharing by laypersons or even clerics in general in the essential roles of government is contrary to the spirit and practice of any monarchical government. In the Catholic Church, the three main governmental functions, executive, judicial, and legislative, are joined in one. Those functions are joined in the office of papacy and the episcopacy. Hence, there are no separation of powers and there are no checks and balances, which is a major problem. So the present governmental structure and its supportive theology, that is, the divine institution of the hierarchical model, are diametrically opposed to genuine transparency, to objective accountability, and to participatory governance. The institutional church is officially a stratified society with a small minority who are a de facto aristocracy and a vast majority who are, what the code says, others, who are also called laity. 1906 encyclical from Pope Pius X. I'm going to read it to you, not the whole thing, just the scary part. It follows that the church is essentially an unequal society, that is, a society comprising of two categories of persons: the pastors, that's the bishops, and the flock, those who occupy a rank in the different degrees of the hierarchy, and the multitude of the faithful. So distinct are these categories that with the pastoral body only rests the necessary right and authority for promoting the end of the society and directing all its members toward that end. The one duty of the multitude is to allow themselves to be led and, like a docile flock, follow the pastors. To further secure clerical power, the authors of the applicable canon in the 83 Code made sure that the definition of church as the people of God is identified in substance with the institutional church, which is, quote, governed by the successor of Peter and the bishops in communion with him. In theory, this should make any attempt to argue for the separation of the two totally moot. But the events of the last 35 years, and not just in the US, but worldwide, have clearly shown that this is not the case. There is a radical, fundamental difference between the people of God and this tiny little minority called the governing hierarchy. And the difference is obvious in what has been happening, not only in our country, but around the world. Finally, the transforming church. It's always been transforming. Now I think we're in the middle of something even more profound, and that's a paradigm shift. The traditional paradigm of the church as a hierarchical institution has encountered a problem it cannot comprehend and consequently cannot solve. And any paradigm, when it meets something it can't comprehend or cannot solve, it changes. And hence, we are in the process, I believe, of a slow but gradual change that we may not even notice because we're in the midst of it. In view of the reality of the surrounding world, this paradigm that we've had no longer functions. Hence, it's shifting. The most apparent is in the broad-based realignment of the centers of power and the balance of power. The transforming process goes beyond the artificial clericalized borders that have prevented it from moving from institution to a way of life. Thinking in terms of lay involvement in the clerical kingdom, yet remaining on the periphery, has to be replaced by thinking and acting as equal participants in the constant process of the Christian life. Canon law provides non-clerics participation on the fringes of the governmental system. Canon law is in the service to the clerical culture, and this culture will not willingly give way to an inclusive culture. Power is addictive, and it corrupts, and power is the currency of the institution as we have known it. A future marked by hope means going beyond just talking about the tragedy of sexual violation, the myriad effects of the clerical betrayal, and the other forms of corruption, to digging into the deep historical, philosophical, anthropological, and theological roots of the core issues that have played the major role in sustaining the history of sexual violence and hierarchical betrayal. It means, in short, looking at the system that has created this nightmare. We have to probe with faith, with courage, and with fearlessness to the deepest levels of the foundations, because only then will we find an accurate understanding of who we are, where we have been, and what we have to do to move the hope of the church as the people of God from a dream to a reality. I'd like to conclude with some words from one of my personal heroes, Mary Collins, who is a victim of sexual abuse in Ireland, who has become one of the most solid leaders in the movement for change and accountability and justice for victims, who took on face-to-face, toe-to-toe, the Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin and came out first, and who took on face-to-face, toe-to-toe, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. She said in a recent interview, "My real vision for the church, which is an extreme one, would be to see it simply return to its roots and be a humble church and one that does away with all the bishops' palaces, all the robes, and all the ancillary things that it's wrapped up in. I'd like to see the church go back to the basic church it was, the church that Christ showed originally. They've developed over the years their own canon laws, their own traditions and theology, and this is twisted to suit what they want it to suit. It's so wrapped up in itself as an institution that it has completely lost sight of what we see in a basic parish. If people still want to be part of the church, they have to change it. They have to see that clericalism is rooted out because their only alternative is to walk away. But if someone wants to remain Catholic, they need to remember it's their church. It's your church, my church, it's our church. And we need to make it the body of Christ. Thank you. Am I done?
No. Okay. We have about 20 minutes for conversation here, so Alice has a mic over there. And then, Callie, would you do me a favor and bring those assessment cards in and make sure people have them for future topics? I think they're out on the table. Okay.
You've given us so much food for thought, and I'm looking forward to re-listening to this and connecting with my notes. My question would be, can you think or could you give us a case study where it's actually worked within a school system, within a church system, somewhere where there's been that movement from the hierarchical structure to the inclusive model that works well?
The only one I can think of offhand, and I know they're out there, and let me just say that to have it happen, it requires, first off, educated, dedicated lay people. There are plenty of them around. But it also requires a priest who's a solid citizen and realize that his priesthood really is rooted in his people. I know of one example, and that's a parish, I believe it's in Syracuse, and I visited there in 2007 or 8 to give a talk. And the guy that picked me up at the airport and took me to a restaurant for dinner, I didn't realize was the pastor until we got to the church. And this was almost a complete participatory operation where he had, the people who preached, for example, on Sunday was a mixture of men, women, people who were capable of teenagers, that kind of thing. The bishop had called him up once and said they had to cease and desist. He said, "What are you going to do, fire me?" So it's still going. And I was there long enough to see that there were a lot of really wonderful outreach programs going on that were very healthy and very effective and very dynamic. And he said, I don't do anything. I kind of keep the doors open, keep the heat coming in. The people do it all. When I was in the Air Force, that's what I tried to create in the chapel communities. And it was easier to do there because I didn't have any bishop breathing down my neck. I just did what I wanted to do. And I was telling Mary on the way over, I got tired of being at the Eucharist on Sunday, being the center of attention, sitting on this throne, little kids coming, bowing to me. So I stopped doing that. I'd walk in with everybody else, and we'd sit, and whoever was supposed to do something went up and did it. They'd give a reading, they'd do something, and then when the canon started, we'd all go up. And that made, for me, spiritually, it was a lot easier, because the whole thing was grating on me so badly. And then I saw another situation similar, but this was in, I think, Rochester Diocese, where I was at the same tour thing, speaking tour. I was invited to a parish where the pastor had been, at that time, the only one known to have gotten up in front of his parish and said, "I am gay." Bingo. Well, you can't imagine the effect that that had on the parish. All of a sudden, his membership, which was sort of mediocre, swelled. And it became a place where everybody was welcome. No matter who you were or what you were welcome there. So it offered a spiritual home for people who did not fall in the usual categories of sexuality that we're supposed to fall into. Divorced people, remarried people, the whole 9 yards. And again, the priest there, the way he operated was pretty much like he said, "I'm a sort of a manager. You know, I make sure that they got pencils for their meetings and paper and the heat's on, and that when decisions are made, I stay out of the way. Because I have to trust. I have to trust these people. And I've learned over the years that they know about Christ probably more than I do, which is a good attitude to have for a priest, because you don't learn a lot of that in the seminary. I mean, I only really learned about what it meant to be a pastoral minister when I was out, especially when I was working in the Chicago Tribunal. I did canon law stuff for divorced people. And dealing with divorced people, it humbled me greatly to see the strength and the faith and the goodness of these people in spite of what we had put them through in our crazy system.
How can we get a copy of your remarks tonight?
I'll leave it for you. It's right here. I ordinarily speak from an outline, except my outline ended up being 27 pages long. I had all these quotes and stuff, so I decided to script it out, and I feel a lot more hamstrung when I do that, because when I can speak from an outline, it's a lot freer. But here's the script.
We can make it available on our website, if that's okay with you, Tom.
Pardon?
If we can make it available on our
Yeah,
website,
sure.
if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I have no objections.
Okay.
They can't do anything to me, so that's okay.
Okay.
I appreciated how you were saying there has been a transformation and that the laity has taken action where in the past they've been very passive. And I think that the changes in technology and the media participation has allowed for this emancipation. And a lot is coming out of the Amazon Synod, and Pope Benedict's book with Cardinal Sarah is an example of the conservative position. But one of the things that happened, and it was kind of astonishing, because when we're in a secular world, the secular world doesn't think that evil is real. But people were invited to the Vatican, and idols were left in one of the Catholic churches on the perimeter of St. Peter's, and there was a pagan ritual in the Vatican gardens, and the Pope was there. And as a consequence of this, the informed people were really upset that there were pagan idols in the church, right by the tabernacle. And we know that amulets and things of these nature are pagan. So what happened was an Austrian went and took the idols and threw them into the Tiber. And the Vatican response to this was that they were going to be arrested for vandalizing the church. But as a consequence of this, there was a groundswelling of Catholics internationally that pagan worship in a Catholic church is not acceptable. And there was a worldwide day of fast and adoration on December 6th. And I, as a 70-year immersion Catholic, was astonished the Vatican had been censored. And we had an hour of adoration at St. Stephen's. At St. John Newman, they had a 24-hour hours of adoration and fasting. But it wasn't just here, it was worldwide. And I think that as Catholics, we have been oppressed with this governance that you're talking about. But I think that we have forgotten we're the ones that are writing the check. And they have to be held at an accountability that we would hold IBM or Coca-Cola, and they have behaved very poorly. And there have been too many contradictions. Cardinal Ratzinger, and I'm not saying whether this is true or false or we can prove it or not, but he made a document that said homosexuality was a sexual deviation and psychiatric condition. But at the same time, we have been ordaining homosexuals, and you have commented on how they have not been fostered. So I think that you're speaking to it. But how many billions of dollars has this cost the church?
There isn't a number that goes that high, I don't think. I didn't know anything about this incident, by the way. I will...
That's okay.
Taylor Marshall?
Okay. Yeah, it's been in lots of different papers too. It's
Okay.
when they had the pregnant woman statue at the
Oh,
Vatican.
yeah,
during
yeah,
the-
I did. I didn't follow it.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to be honest. I got enough on my plate dealing with what I'm dealing with. I'm working now as a consultant and expert witness to 9 attorneys general in this country. Plus, I'm involved in Europe at the same time. And I'm not telling you that to impress you, but the issue is all over the place. And so I have to leave some things off.
Thank you for your words. As a Catholic, deeply concerned as you are, and I think everyone here is, the question is, how do we help this church transform and become more responsive in shaping itself into the image of Christ? And we see, we've been discussing the problems we've got right now. But you mentioned that the civil authorities have done a lot to bring about change that was being resisted with the cover-ups and so forth. As a person in the pew, though, I feel like we have to be, for lack of a better word, we have to be activists. And we have to somehow pressure our church to be more inclusive, to be more responsive, to be more just. But we don't really have a lot of open leadership, because open leadership's not really accepted if it challenges the system.
That's right.
So I just wonder if you have any thoughts in terms of people struggling, like I think most of us are struggling, with ideas and structures that we might try to create within our own communities to address this.
Well, I understand that, and I've got to be honest with you. That question gets asked a lot. I've asked the question myself. We're dealing with a monarchical government still, and it's still deeply entrenched, deeply entrenched. So these situations that you have, where you have a governmental situation or a parochial situation where there's participatory action going on, it's because the leadership has been enlightened enough to allow it to happen. But that problem could change immediately. As soon as one bishop goes and another one takes his place, and that's happened. For example, the former bishop of Pueblo, Colorado, Charles Buswell, was very, very open. And I recall being at a meeting when I was in the embassy in the inside where the papal nuncio said, Buswell doesn't know how to be a bishop. And one of the guys said, yeah, the problem is he does. And so, there's no one, the only thing I can say is this. First off, the money thing is important. Cut the money off. And don't say, well, Father Joe is such a good priest, we don't want to stop giving. Stop giving to Father Joe. Because pretty soon, he's going to be running out of dough, and he's going to say to the bishop, look, they're cutting me off because of you. That's what you want to happen there. And the only thing I can say is first off, I'm past the point, myself, personally, of trying to repair and put bandages on what we've got. This is just me. I've seen too much. I've been in too many places. I'm not a church reformer. I'm a rebuilder, you know. And I think those who think that it needs to have a complete flattening and starting from scratch are not far off base. Is it possible? Yes, it is. The primitive church, the original what we had, didn't have any of this stuff. Now, I'm going to make a disclosure, I guess you call it that. I'm an alcoholic in recovery. I got 28 years of sobriety. I've been in AA for 28 years. That's my church, the Church of St. Bob. I go every Sunday at least. Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson founded the organization. Now, AA works probably the same way we did back in the first century. It's totally spiritual. There's no therapy. AA is totally spiritual. Nobody really knows how it works, but it's completely spiritual. There's no anyone giving orders to anybody else. There's no bishops, there's no priests, there's no hierarchy, there's no property, there's no money, there's no Vatican. We take up a little collection every meeting so we can keep paying the rent and buy coffee. But that's AA. But what's also more important about it is we live by what we call the 12 steps. We acknowledge your powerlessness in front of the higher power. And one of those 12 steps is that we do what we call a personal inventory. We just call it an examination of conscience. What have I done wrong today? Where can I make it better? But there's no judging. How can we judge? I mean, you get about 20 people in a room. We've all been in the toilet, and some deeper than others, and we've all done the craziest stuff, but now we're sober, or trying to be sober. How can we judge anybody else? And that's a lived reality. And so when somebody goes down and falls, somebody, as we say, goes out, what's the reaction? Guy comes back in, he's been gone for 2 weeks, haven't seen him in a meeting. And he says, I have to confess to the group that I went out and I got drunk, stayed drunk, went on a 2-week bender. I blew my kids' tuition money for high school. I beat my wife up about 3 times. I had sex with my daughter. I ran over the dog, and now I'm back. And you know what the response is? Boy, we're glad you're back. Nobody's going to judge him. He knows what's going on. He knows what he's done wrong. And I think that is the thing that I look for in the real church. That's what Mary Collins was talking about, something that simple that doesn't have all this power stuff. Well, you get right to the essence, which is treating each other as we should be treated, no matter what color you are, what gender you are, what your sexual orientation is, what your kinks are or aren't, doesn't matter. Because all that stuff is stuff that we're told is bad. I went through a really profoundly painful spiritual odyssey at one point. Through all of this, I'd lost everything. I felt I couldn't believe in anything. So I started searching, and it was I guess a spiritual journey, you might call it. And I was helped along the way by 2 people. One was a very, very dear friend of mine who was a physician. Unfortunately, he passed away, but he was a physician who was gay. And he'd been married, and when he finally decided he couldn't deal with it anymore, he came out. And so he was a very profound Catholic, but he had to take being rejected by his church. So we both went on this journey together. And this guy knew as much theology as any theologian I've ever met. I picked up a book one day by Bishop John Spong, retired Bishop of Newark, New Jersey, called Jesus for Non-Believers. And I got hooked. And I read it. And I read every one of his books. And I said, this guy is talking to me. Because he was saying the things that I was troubled with. But one of the things he said was that your image of God, of Jesus Christ, is something somebody else gave you. You got that from someone else, some other human. Nobody's seen him face to face. Nobody's seen God. And to say that, the devil is a real person, as I heard the bishop in Arlington say one time, is such a joke. How do you know? Have you been there? But this is the thing, the acceptance and the fact that we can think and worry about these things and come up with answers, and we don't have to go by the book. The scariest thing to a Catholic cleric, the scariest thing, is an adult Catholic. Am I right?
One more.
Yes, what do you think about this as a national model? Tim Doyle, when he was Bishop of Milwaukee, hid $75 million in the Milwaukee Cemetery Fund from the victims. The courts had awarded them this money, and he hid it in the cemetery fund. Those graves don't need that much manure. But what happened to him, JP2 named him the most prominent job in the country, Cardinal of New York, and more prominent beyond this country also. I have a modest proposal. Whenever we are asked to give money to the church, we have a moral responsibility to ask, is this money going to be hidden from the victims? Thank you.
That's a good question, and it's very well put, but there's a problem. Who controls all the money in a diocese? You're a canon lawyer? Who controls the money in a diocese? The bishop. The bishop can do whatever he wants to do with the money. You can give him $10 million and say, I want every bit of this for the people who have dogs and cats in this archdiocese, that they have a decent lifestyle for the cats and dogs. And the bishop can do whatever he wants. He can take that and buy himself a house on the shore that's worth $1 zillion, because that is the way canon law works. In some dioceses, the bishops have decided they're going to create a bank for the diocese. So they tell all the pastors, in your savings accounts, send it all to me. We're putting it in the diocesan bank. And if you want some of your money for capital improvements, we'll loan it to you at an interest rate that you pay. So you got to borrow your own money from them and pay them money to use your money. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. But that's the way it works. So the better answer is don't give them anything. Nothing. And say, I'm not giving anything, and this is why. Because you have no guarantee. They keep saying, we're not paying the victims out of the donations of the people. Where else does the money come from? Well, it's from investments. Okay, well, where did the money to make the investments come from? It all, in this country, comes from donations from the believers. In Germany, the church gets a chunk of the tax. In Austria, they get a chunk of the tax, but not over here. So anything, any of those fairy tales that you hear are not true. They're lies to put you off. I mean, that's a fact. Your idea is great, but there's a barrier to it. The better idea, don't give them anything.
Okay, it's just about 9 o'clock. That's our ending time. If anybody needs to talk to Tom, he's going to at least be up here for a little while. Our next time that we meet for the What's Next is going to be on March 3rd. Natalia Imperatori Lee is going to talk about the Me Too movement and the church. So we welcome you back then. If anybody would like to come to our CLIP meetings, our Catholic Lay Interparish Partnership, our next meeting is February 8th at 8:30 in the morning. Linda? Yes, yeah, February 8th, 8:30 in the morning. And it's in this building. It's going to be on the first floor, just as you come in the door in room 102.
Keep telling yourselves that you can do it, because if you do that, you will do it. And I just want to say before we go, I'm grateful I was invited, because I got more out of this than you got. And the reason I say that is because I listened and heard a lot of things from you all that give me a charge of hope, which I don't see too much of at all.
And if you'd leave those cards, if you have, as I said, we're not using these for assessment, we're using them to find out ideas for things that we need to do in the future. So if you have some ideas, put them on and just leave your cards and we'll come and collect them. Can I just say thank you for your work? Yes.
Thank you. My work has been my life, and it has been a privilege for me to serve the bravest people I've ever met. And those are the ones who've had the courage to stand up to the system. It's like two guys driving a little bulldozer trying to move Mount Everest and not really seeing, but it's moving. Thank you.